Have you ever been in a situation where your specialized knowledge could change everything, but speaking up might cost you the little stability you have left? Whether you're in New York, California, or anywhere else, we all face moments where our expertise becomes both a gift and a burden. Anna Rossi wiped down the marble tabletop for the third time, her movements precise despite the exhaustion weighing down her shoulders. The Bella Vista restaurant perched on the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast like a jewel, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the Mediterranean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. At 28, she should have been analyzing Renaissance manuscripts at the University of Florence, not serving overpriced wine to wealthy tourists who barely acknowledged her existence. The irony wasn't lost on her that she held a PhD in medieval and Renaissance linguistics, yet couldn't afford anything more substantial than the employee meal the kitchen grudgingly provided each shift. 3 years had passed since her father's sudden death had shattered both her heart and her financial security, leaving behind medical bills that consumed her small inheritance and forced her into this elegant purgatory of survival. Anna tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, noting how her once soft hands now bore the calluses of constant work. Her father would have been heartbroken to see her reduced to this, she thought, remembering Professor Giovanni Rossi's pride when she defended her dissertation on ecclesiastical Latin evolution. He'd been the foremost expert in Renaissance art restoration in Italy, his meticulous calligraphy recreations sought after by museums worldwide. Now his knowledge lived only in her memory and the boxes of his research notes she couldn't bear to unpack in her tiny apartment. The afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the restaurant's interior as manager Benedetto approached, his expression unusually serious. Anna straightened, hoping she hadn't done something wrong. Jobs like this one were precious and precarious. Benedetto gestured toward the private dining alcove overlooking the sea. "We have very important guests arriving within the hour," he said quietly. "Table 7 requires absolute discretion and perfect service. These are powerful men conducting significant business." Anna nodded, though her stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. Important guests usually meant more pressure, higher stakes, and greater potential for the kind of mistake that could cost her this job. She needed this position desperately, even if it felt like wearing shoes that didn't fit. As she prepared the private alcove, Anna couldn't help but appreciate the space's understated elegance. The round table seated 6 comfortably, positioned to take advantage of the spectacular view while maintaining privacy from other diners. Crystal stemware caught the light like scattered diamonds, and the white linens felt expensive beneath her fingertips. Whatever business these men conducted clearly involved serious money. The first guest arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, and Anna immediately understood why Benedetto had emphasized discretion. Lorenzo Vitali moved through the restaurant with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command, his presence somehow filling the space without any obvious effort. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair silvered at the temples and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. His charcoal suit was clearly bespoke, the kind of tailored perfection that suggested wealth so established it didn't need to announce itself. Anna had heard whispers about Lorenzo Vitali over the years. Former rumors spoke of criminal connections, though more recent stories painted him as a legitimate businessman who transformed his family's enterprises into humanitarian ventures. His organization now funded schools and hospitals throughout southern Italy, though the shadows of his past still commanded respect and caution from those who knew the family name. "Good afternoon," Anna said as she approached his table. "May I offer you something while you wait for your companions?" "Espresso, please," Lorenzo replied, his voice carrying the cultured accent of educated Naples. "And perhaps you could inform the kitchen that we'll require complete privacy once my associates arrive." Anna nodded, studying his face briefly as she memorized his preferences. There was something compelling about Lorenzo Vitali, an intensity that suggested depths beneath his polished exterior. She found herself wondering what had driven him from whatever his previous life had been into philanthropy, though such curiosity was dangerous for someone in her position. The other men arrived within minutes of each other, and Anna immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. Where Lorenzo commanded through quiet presence, these newcomers carried themselves with the aggressive confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. The leader, a heavy-set man with expensive gold jewelry, introduced himself as Heinrich Weber from a European Cultural Preservation Consortium. As Anna served drinks and took their meal orders, she couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation. They spoke in a mixture of Italian, German, and English, discussing what seemed to be a significant acquisition of historical documents. Weber repeatedly mentioned Vatican archives and papal authentication, while his two associates spread photographs and papers across the table between courses. Anna's academic training kicked in almost involuntarily as she caught glimpses of the documents during service. Even from a distance, she could see they were dealing with manuscript pages that appeared to be quite old, though something about the Latin text visible in the photographs made her pause. It wasn't until she was refilling water glasses that she heard Weber speak a specific phrase that made her blood freeze. He was reading from one of the documents, pronouncing Latin words that should never have appeared in the context he was describing. Weber gestured grandly at a particular photograph as he spoke to Lorenzo. This papal treaty from 1453 grants exclusive mineral rights throughout the Papal States. Our consortium has verified its authenticity through carbon dating and linguistic analysis. The Vatican has already provided preliminary authentication. This document alone is worth over 1 billion euros in modern property rights. Anna's hand trembled slightly as she finished pouring water, her mind racing. The Latin phrase Weber had just pronounced as evidence of the document's authenticity was ecclesiastical Latin that hadn't developed until the late 1500s. She was absolutely certain because she'd written her dissertation specifically on the evolution of Vatican Latin during the Renaissance period. That particular construction, specifically the use of territorial jurisdiction terminology, didn't exist until after the Council of Trent in the 1560s. The document Weber was presenting as authentic 14th-century papal correspondence was using Latin that wouldn't be invented for another century. Anna backed away from the table, her heart pounding as the implications crashed over her. This wasn't just a business meeting. These men were attempting to defraud Lorenzo Vitali of over €1 billion using forged historical documents. And from what she could tell, the forgeries were extremely sophisticated, good enough to fool most experts who weren't specialists in the precise evolution of ecclesiastical Latin. She retreated to the service station, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she'd discovered. This was exactly the kind of fraud her father had spent years warning museums about. He'd seen countless cases of sophisticated forgeries that relied on the average person's inability to detect subtle anachronisms in historical language use. But what could she do? She was a waitress desperately clinging to a job she needed to survive. These were clearly powerful, wealthy men conducting business worth more money than she could imagine. Who would believe her word against theirs? And even if someone did believe her, what guarantee did she have that Weber and his associates wouldn't retaliate against someone who'd cost them such an enormous payday? Anna glanced back toward table 7, where Lorenzo was examining the documents with obvious interest while Weber continued his sales pitch. Something about Lorenzo's careful attention to detail suggested he was nobody's fool, but even intelligent men could be deceived by sufficiently sophisticated fraud, especially when the forgeries played into existing knowledge and expectations. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, reminding her that knowledge carried responsibility, that expertise in used when needed was just as morally compromised as deliberate ignorance. Professor Giovanni Rossi had never walked away from fraud when he had the power to expose it, even when doing so had cost him professionally. Anna realized she was facing a choice that would define not just her immediate future, but her ability to live with herself. She could remain silent, serve dessert and coffee, collect her tips, and pretend she hadn't noticed anything wrong. Or she could risk everything she had left on the chance that speaking truth to power might matter more than her personal security. Looking back toward the table where €1 billion fraud was unfolding in the golden afternoon light, Anna Rossi made her decision. Anna took a deep breath and smoothed her black server's apron, knowing that what she was about to do could destroy her life. Her father had always said that truth was worth any personal cost, but he'd never had to choose between honesty and homelessness. Still, she couldn't stand by and watch Lorenzo Vitali be defrauded of €1 billion, especially not when she possessed the specific expertise to prevent it. She approached table 7 just as Weber was sliding the document across the polished surface toward Lorenzo, a gold fountain pen poised for what would be the most expensive signature in history. The consortium members wore expressions of barely contained greed, while Lorenzo studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who hadn't survived in dangerous business by making careless decisions. The Mediterranean breeze drifted through the open terrace doors, carrying the scent of salt and lemon trees as Anna gathered her courage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped closer to the table, knowing there would be no going back once she spoke. "Forgive me, gentlemen," Anna said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I couldn't help overhearing your discussion, and I believe there may be an issue with your document." Weber's head snapped toward her, his pale eyes flashing with immediate anger. "What did you say?" His German accent thickened with irritation as he gestured dismissively. "This is a private business meeting. Return to your duties immediately." Lorenzo, however, held up one hand to stop Weber's tirade, his intelligent gaze fixed on Anna with sudden interest. "What kind of issue?" he asked calmly, though she could sense the sharp attention beneath his composed exterior. Anna's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to continue. "The Latin phrase you quoted from the supposed 1453 papal treaty uses ecclesiastical terminology that didn't develop until after the Council of Trent in the 1560s. Specifically, the jurisdictional language referencing territorial sovereignty over mineral rights wasn't codified in Vatican Latin until 1562 at the earliest." The silence that followed her words felt heavy with danger. Weber's face flushed red while his two associates exchanged sharp glances that made Anna's skin crawl. She could feel their hostility like a physical force, but Lorenzo leaned forward in his chair, clearly intrigued rather than annoyed. "You understand ecclesiastical Latin?" Lorenzo asked, his voice carrying a new note of respect that made Anna's pulse quicken despite her fear. "I have a PhD in medieval and Renaissance linguistics from the University of Florence," Anna replied, fighting to keep her voice steady as Weber began to rise from his chair. "My dissertation specifically focused on the evolution of Vatican administrative language during the Counter-Reformation period." Weber slammed his hand down on the table, making the crystal stemware ring like alarm bells. "This is ridiculous. We're not going to sit here and listen to some waitress question documents that have been authenticated by experts across Europe." He turned toward Lorenzo with forced calm. "Signore Vitali, surely you don't intend to allow restaurant staff to interfere with our business." But Lorenzo's attention remained fixed on Anna, and she could see the sharp intelligence working behind his dark eyes. "Explain exactly what you observed," he said quietly, though his tone carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Anna glanced nervously at Weber and his associates, who were watching her with expressions that promised unpleasant consequences for her interference. The phrase referring to exclusive papal sovereignty over subterranean resources uses the construction spiritualum et temporalum jurisdictionum in mineralibus, she said, her academic training taking over despite her terror. That specific legal terminology wasn't developed until Pope Pius IV's administrative reforms, more than a century after your document's supposed creation date. Weber pushed his chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. "Enough. This is harassment and defamation of legitimate business documents. Fräulein, you have no idea what kind of forces you're meddling with." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Anna took an involuntary step backward as Weber's associates began to stand as well. She suddenly realized just how isolated they were in this private dining alcove, how easily three large men could silence one defenseless woman before anyone could intervene. "Actually," Lorenzo said softly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made all three consortium members freeze, "I think she knows exactly what she's talking about." He rose from his chair with fluid grace, and Anna noticed how his movement somehow changed the entire dynamic at the table. Where Weber had tried to command through bluster and intimidation, Lorenzo commanded through something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. Weber's face went pale as Lorenzo stepped closer to Anna, positioning himself slightly between her and the other men. "You said you studied at Florence?" Lorenzo asked her, his proximity making her intensely aware of his height and the expensive cologne that didn't quite mask something harder underneath. "Yes," Anna whispered, struggling to think clearly with Lorenzo so close and Weber's associates looking like wolves who'd been denied their prey. I specialized in document authentication and forgery detection. My father was Professor Giovanni Rossi. He taught Renaissance art restoration and was an expert in historical calligraphy analysis. Lorenzo's eyebrows rose slightly at her father's name. Giovanni Rossi was legendary in authentication circles, he said quietly, then turned back toward Weber with an expression that made the German man take a step backward. I think we should examine these documents more carefully. Weber's composure finally cracked completely. Listen, you little bitch, he snarled at Anna, his cultured facade dissolving into something ugly and threatening. You have no idea who you're dealing with or what the consequences of your interference will be. My organization has resources and reach that extend far beyond anything your provincial Italian mind can comprehend. The change in Lorenzo was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment, he was a sophisticated businessman engaged in careful negotiations. The next, he radiated lethal intent that made the air itself seem dangerous. Weber evidently recognized the shift because his bluster died in his throat as Lorenzo moved with predatory grace. I suggest you reconsider your tone when addressing the lady, Lorenzo said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded extreme violence. And I strongly recommend you explain exactly how sophisticated these forgeries are and who else might be involved in this operation. Anna found herself pressed against Lorenzo's side as one of Weber's associates made a subtle movement toward what was probably a concealed weapon. She could feel the controlled strength in Lorenzo's frame as he kept himself positioned protectively in front of her while maintaining visual contact with all three men. Weber looked around the restaurant desperately, perhaps realizing that his intimidation tactics had backfired catastrophically. These documents are completely legitimate, he insisted, though his voice now carried desperation rather than authority. Any suggestion otherwise constitutes slander against respected European cultural institutions. Then you won't mind if we have them examined by additional experts, Lorenzo suggested with deadly politeness. I'm sure someone with Dr. Rossi's qualifications could provide a more detailed analysis of exactly how these forgeries were created. The word forgeries hung in the air like a death sentence for Weber's elaborate scheme. Anna could see the calculation in the man's eyes as he weighed his options, none of which appeared to offer the billion-euro payday he'd been anticipating. Weber's associate whispered something urgent in German that Anna couldn't quite catch, though she heard the word Polizei and understood they were discussing police involvement. The consortium was clearly deciding whether to cut their losses and run or escalate to more direct methods of protecting their investment. I think this meeting is concluded, Lorenzo said firmly, his hand settling protectively on Anna's shoulder in a way that sent unexpected warmth through her despite the dangerous circumstances. Gentlemen, I suggest you collect your materials and leave immediately. Weber's face twisted with rage and something deeper that looked like genuine fear. This isn't over, he said, his eyes fixed on Anna with naked hatred. You've made a very powerful enemy today, girl. My organization doesn't forget debts or insults. Then your organization can discuss their concerns with mine, Lorenzo replied, and there was something in his tone that made Weber go white as sheets. Anna felt Lorenzo's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder as he added, and they can be assured that I take the protection of my interests very seriously indeed. The three men left the restaurant with their forged documents and wounded pride, but Anna could see in Weber's eyes that this confrontation had solved nothing. She'd saved Lorenzo from financial fraud, but she'd also painted a target on herself that she was completely unprepared to handle. As the silence settled over the now empty dining alcove, Anna realized that her simple decision to speak the truth had just irrevocably changed her life in ways she couldn't begin to predict. Lorenzo's villa overlooking the Bay of Naples was nothing like Anna had expected. Instead of the ostentatious display of wealth she'd imagined, the restored 18th-century estate radiated understated elegance and genuine appreciation for historical beauty. Frescoed ceilings soared above rooms filled with carefully curated Renaissance art, while tall windows offered breathtaking views of Vesuvius in the distance. Anna sat in Lorenzo's private study, surrounded by more books than she'd seen outside of university libraries, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 6 hours. After Weber's threats at the restaurant, Lorenzo had insisted she couldn't return to her apartment safely. His security team was already investigating the consortium, while Anna remained under protection that felt more like gentle imprisonment in paradise. "I still can't believe this is real," Anna murmured, accepting the glass of wine Lorenzo offered as he settled into the leather chair across from her desk. "This morning I was worried about rent money, and now I'm apparently the target of international art forgers." Lorenzo studied her face with the same careful attention he'd given the fraudulent documents. "Tell me about your father's work," he said quietly. "You mentioned he was an expert in Renaissance art restoration. What kind of projects did he handle?" Anna felt the familiar pang of grief that always accompanied thoughts of her father. Giovanni had been her mentor, her best friend, and her connection to the academic world she'd loved so deeply. "Papa was one of the most respected restoration specialists in Italy," she said, surprised by how easily the words came in Lorenzo's presence. "He worked with major museums throughout Europe, specializing in 15th and 16th century manuscripts and paintings. His calligraphy reproductions were so precise that authentication experts used his work as examples of period writing techniques." Something shifted in Lorenzo's expression, a sharpening of attention that made Anna suddenly wary. "How did he die?" Lorenzo asked, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested the question was more significant than it appeared. Anna's throat tightened with the memory of that terrible phone call 3 years ago. "Heart attack," she whispered. He'd been working late in his studio, and his assistant found him the next morning. The doctors said the stress of a major authentication project had likely triggered the episode. He'd been working on some important manuscripts for a private collector, something that had been consuming his time for weeks. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the wine glass in his hands. Anna could see him processing information, making connections that she couldn't yet understand. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken implications that made her increasingly nervous. "What kind of manuscripts?" Lorenzo asked finally, and there was something in his tone that made Anna's stomach clench with sudden dread. "I don't know exactly," Anna admitted. "Papa was always secretive about high-value projects. He said discretion was essential when dealing with pieces worth millions of euros. All I know is that he'd been hired by a European consortium to authenticate some Vatican documents that had supposedly been discovered in a private archive." The words hung in the air between them like a revelation that changed everything. Anna watched Lorenzo's face transform as the implications became clear, and she felt her world shifting once again in ways she couldn't control. "Anna," Lorenzo said gently, but she could hear the gravity beneath his careful tone. "I think your father may have discovered the same fraud you exposed today, and I think Weber's consortium may have killed him to protect their operation." The accusation hit Anna like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands shake as she set down her wine glass. "That's impossible," she whispered, though even as she spoke, pieces of a horrible puzzle began falling into place in her mind. "Papa died of natural causes. There was no evidence of violence." Lorenzo leaned forward, his presence somehow both comforting and protective despite the devastating news he was sharing. "Think about it," he said softly. "Your father was the foremost expert in Renaissance calligraphy techniques. If someone wanted to create sophisticated forgeries of Vatican documents, they would need access to his knowledge and his reproduction techniques. If he discovered what they were really doing and threatened to expose them." Anna's mind raced back through her father's final weeks, remembering details she'd dismissed at the time as stress and overwork. Giovanni had been agitated, sleeping poorly, making cryptic comments about people not being who they seemed to be. He'd started making copies of his research notes, saying something about protecting his legacy. She'd thought he was just being paranoid about academic competitors. He was trying to gather evidence. Anna realized, the truth crashing over her like a devastating wave. Papa knew they were using his work to create forgeries, and he was building a case against them. That's why he died. They murdered him to protect their billion-euro fraud operation. Tears burned her eyes as anger and grief warred in her chest. Her gentle, scholarly father had been killed by criminals who saw his expertise as both an asset and a threat. The heart attack that had seemed so random and cruel had actually been cold-blooded murder disguised as natural death. Lorenzo moved from his chair to the small sofa beside her, his proximity offering comfort without presumption. "I'm sorry," Anna, he said quietly, his hand covering hers with surprising gentleness. I know how difficult this must be to accept. Anna found herself leaning into his strength, craving human connection in the face of such overwhelming revelation. Lorenzo's presence felt solid and protective, a safe harbor in the storm of emotions threatening to drown her. She could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body, making her intensely aware of him as a man rather than just her unlikely protector. How did you know? She whispered, afraid to look up and meet his eyes. How did you figure it out so quickly? Lorenzo was quiet for a moment, and Anna could sense him weighing how much truth to share. Because I've seen their work before, he admitted finally. Weber's consortium has been operating sophisticated art fraud schemes throughout Europe for years. They target wealthy collectors and institutions with forgeries so perfect that most experts can't detect them. Your father wasn't their first victim. Anna pulled back to look at him, suddenly aware that there were depths to Lorenzo Vitali she hadn't begun to understand. How do you know so much about international art fraud? She asked, though she suspected she wasn't going to like the answer. Lorenzo's smile was rueful and tinged with old pain. Because my family was involved in similar operations before I took control of our enterprises, he said quietly. When I inherited the Vitali organization, I discovered that my father and uncle had been financing art forgery networks as investment opportunities. It took me years to untangle those connections and transform our business into legitimate humanitarian work. The confession hung between them, another revelation that changed Anna's understanding of the man who'd protected her. Lorenzo Vitali hadn't just been born into wealth and respectability. He'd inherited a criminal empire and chosen to dismantle it, risking everything to build something better from the ruins of his family's legacy. Anna studied his face in the soft lamplight, seeing shadows of old guilt and determination in his expression. She could only imagine the courage it had taken to turn against his own family's traditions, to choose ethics over easy profit when surrounded by people who measured success in money and power. Why did you change everything? She asked softly, genuinely curious about the man beneath the protective exterior. Lorenzo was quiet for so long that Anna thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pain that resonated in her chest. My mother was an art historian, he said quietly. She spent her life studying Renaissance culture, trying to preserve and protect historical treasures. When she discovered what my father's business was really funding, the knowledge broke her heart. She died believing that her husband had been destroying everything she devoted her life to protecting. Anna felt tears sting her eyes at the raw emotion in Lorenzo's voice. She could see the guilt and love warring in his expression, the weight of carrying responsibility for crimes he'd never committed but felt obligated to atone for. She would have loved your work now, Anna said impulsively, then blushed at her presumption. I mean, the way you've transformed everything into helping people instead of exploiting them. That takes incredible strength. Lorenzo looked up at her with surprise and something deeper that made Anna's heart race unexpectedly. You really believe that? He asked, and she could hear genuine uncertainty beneath his confidence. Of course, Anna replied, realizing how much she meant it. You could have continued your family's profitable criminal activities, but you chose to honor your mother's values instead. That's not weakness, Lorenzo. That's heroism. The moment stretched between them, charged with awareness that went beyond gratitude or simple attraction. Anna found herself studying the strong line of Lorenzo's jaw, the way his dark eyes seemed to see straight through her careful defenses. He was unlike any man she'd ever known, dangerous and gentle simultaneously, powerful enough to command respect from criminals while treating her with consideration that made her feel precious. Lorenzo reached up to brush away a tear from her cheek that Anna hadn't realized had fallen, his touch sending electricity through her entire body. We're going to find everyone responsible for your father's death, he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. And we're going to make sure they face justice for what they've done. Anna believed him completely, which should have been terrifying given what she was learning about the scope of the conspiracy against her. Instead, she felt safer than she had in 3 years, protected not just by Lorenzo's resources, but by his personal commitment to seeing justice done. As they sat together in the lamplight, surrounded by books and the weight of shared revelations, Anna realized that her simple decision to expose fraud in a restaurant had led her into something far more complex and dangerous than she'd imagined. But it had also led her to Lorenzo Vitali, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt like she might not have to face the world entirely alone. Outside the windows, night settled over the Bay of Naples, while inside the villa, two people drawn together by tragedy and truth began to discover that some connections were worth any risk to protect. The investigation results arrived at dawn, delivered by Lorenzo's security chief Marco along with espresso, and the kind of grim news that changed everything. Anna sat in the villa's breakfast room overlooking the gardens, watching Lorenzo's face grow increasingly dark as he read through the files spread across the marble table. "It's worse than we thought," Lorenzo said quietly, sliding a photograph across to Anna. "The consortium isn't just operating in Italy. They've been systematically targeting dead artists and scholars throughout Europe, using stolen research and techniques to create forgeries worth billions." Anna studied the photograph with growing horror. It showed her father's private studio, but not as she remembered it. Every filing cabinet had been opened, research papers scattered across the floor, and her father's precious calligraphy samples were missing from their protective cases. Someone had methodically looted Giovanni Rossi's life work after his death. "They took everything," Anna whispered, her hands trembling as she recognized her father's handwriting on documents scattered throughout the image. His reproduction techniques, his authentication methods, even his personal research notes about detecting forgeries. They stole his entire legacy. Lorenzo moved to stand behind her chair, his hand settling protectively on her shoulder as she struggled with the implications. "According to our investigation," he said gently, "Weber's consortium is actually a front for the Kozlov crime family based in Prague. They've been using your father's techniques to authenticate forged documents for buyers throughout Europe and America." Anna leaned back against Lorenzo's strength, desperately needing the comfort of human contact as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "How many people have they defrauded using Papa's work?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Marco estimates at least 30 major transactions in the past 2 years, Lorenzo replied, his voice tight with anger. "Museums, private collectors, even government agencies have been victimized. The total fraud amount exceeds 5 billion euros, and every single forgery used techniques pioneered by your father." The weight of that revelation crushed down on Anna like a physical force. Her father's life work, his passion for preserving cultural heritage, had been perverted into the largest art fraud operation in European history. Giovanni Rossi's name would forever be connected to the destruction of everything he devoted his life to protecting. Anna felt tears burning her eyes as guilt and rage warred in her chest. If she'd paid more attention to her father's final weeks, if she'd insisted on knowing more about his projects, maybe she could have prevented his murder and protected his research from being stolen and misused. "This isn't your fault," Lorenzo said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Your father was dealing with sophisticated criminals who had planned this operation for years. There was nothing you could have done to prevent what happened to him. But I can stop them now," Anna said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I know Papa's techniques better than anyone alive. I can identify every forgery they've created and prove how they were made. I can destroy their entire operation." Lorenzo's hand tightened on her shoulder, and she could feel tension radiating through his frame. "Anna, what you're suggesting is incredibly dangerous. The Kozlov family doesn't hesitate to eliminate threats, and if they realize you can expose their entire network, then we make sure they don't realize it until it's too late," Anna interrupted, turning in her chair to face him. "Lorenzo, these criminals murdered my father and desecrated his legacy. They're using his work to steal from museums and collectors who trust that cultural heritage is being preserved honestly. I won't let them continue destroying everything Papa believed in." Something shifted in Lorenzo's expression as he looked down at her, seeing perhaps the same determination that had driven her to risk her job exposing fraud in the restaurant. Anna realized that despite his protective instincts, Lorenzo understood the need for justice that burned in her chest like a living flame. "What did you have in mind?" Lorenzo asked, his tone suggesting he already suspected he wasn't going to like her answer. Anna stood and moved to the window overlooking the bay, organizing her thoughts as she watched fishing boats heading out for their morning catch. The consortium needs to authenticate their forgeries publicly to sell them to major institutions, she said slowly. That means they'll want to use my expertise again, especially after yesterday's demonstration of my knowledge. Lorenzo joined her at the window, his reflection visible in the glass beside hers as she continued thinking through the implications. They know I can detect their forgeries, which makes me either their greatest threat or their most valuable potential asset. If we can convince them that I'm willing to authenticate their work in exchange for money or protection. Absolutely not, Lorenzo said immediately, his voice carrying the kind of authority that probably ended most arguments before they began. I'm not using you as bait for criminals who've already murdered your father. The risk is completely unacceptable. Anna turned to face him, seeing protective determination in his dark eyes that sent warmth through her despite the gravity of their situation. She understood his concern, could even appreciate the gentlemanly impulse to shield her from danger, but this wasn't about her safety anymore. This was about justice for her father and protection for every cultural institution the Kozlov family planned to defraud. Lorenzo, Anna said softly, stepping closer until she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. I know you want to protect me, and I'm grateful for that in ways I can't express. But these criminals destroyed my family, and they're destroying everything my father spent his life preserving. I can't live with myself if I don't try to stop them. The space between them seemed charged with tension that went beyond their disagreement about strategy. Anna found herself intensely aware of Lorenzo's proximity. The way his expensive shirt couldn't quite disguise the muscular frame beneath, the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with morning coffee, and the salt air drifting through the open windows. Lorenzo reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch sending electricity through her entire body. Anna, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion she couldn't quite identify. You're asking me to risk losing you when I've just found you. I don't think I'm strong enough for that. The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any declaration of love could have been. Anna could see genuine fear in Lorenzo's eyes, not the strategic concern of a businessman protecting an asset, but the raw terror of a man facing the possibility of losing someone precious. Anna covered his hands with hers, leaning into his touch as her heart raced with recognition of feelings she'd been trying to ignore since yesterday's crisis began. Lorenzo, she whispered, what's happening between us? Something that terrifies me, Lorenzo admitted, his thumb stroking gently across her cheek. Something that makes me want to abandon every principle of logic and safety just to keep you close. Anna felt her breath catch as the admission she'd been avoiding crystallized into undeniable truth. She was falling in love with Lorenzo Vitali, this complex man who'd inherited darkness and chosen light, who commanded criminal respect while treating her with tenderness that made her feel cherished. I'm scared too, Anna confessed, surprised by how easily the words came. I've never felt anything like this before, and the timing couldn't be worse. We're planning to take down international criminals, and I can barely think straight when you're this close to me. Lorenzo's smile was rueful and gentle simultaneously, transforming his face from intimidating authority to something infinitely more human and appealing. Maybe that's exactly why we should stop fighting what we both feel, he suggested quietly. If we're going to risk everything anyway, maybe we should at least be honest about what we're risking it for. Anna's heart pounded as Lorenzo leaned closer, giving her time to retreat if she wanted to maintain the careful distance they'd been preserving. Instead, she rose on her toes to meet him halfway, closing the gap between protection and partnership, between gratitude and something far deeper. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning and careful, but it quickly deepened as 3 years of loneliness and yesterday's life-changing revelations combined to create desperate need for connection. Anna felt Lorenzo's arms circle her waist, pulling her against his chest while she buried her fingers in his dark hair, amazed by how perfectly she seemed to fit against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Anna knew that everything had changed between them in ways that couldn't be undone. She could see the same recognition in Lorenzo's eyes, along with wonder and something that looked remarkably like happiness despite their dangerous circumstances. Anna, Lorenzo said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. If we're going to do this, if we're going to trap the consortium and bring down the Kozlov family, then we do it together as partners. Equal partners. I won't ask you to step back from seeking justice for your father, but I also won't let you face this danger alone. Anna felt tears of relief and gratitude burn her eyes at his words. Partnership was what she'd hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect, especially from a man accustomed to command and control. The fact that Lorenzo was willing to treat her as an equal despite his protective instincts told her everything she needed to know about his character and his feelings. Partners, Anna agreed, sealing the word with another soft kiss that tasted like promise and shared determination. As morning light streamed through the windows of the villa, Anna realized that her father would have approved of what she was planning. Giovanni Rossi had devoted his life to preserving truth and beauty, and he'd raised her to value justice over safety when protecting cultural heritage was at stake. Using his knowledge to destroy the criminals who'd perverted his legacy wasn't betrayal of his memory. It was the ultimate expression of everything he'd taught her about standing up for what was right. Together, she and Lorenzo would bring down the network that had murdered her father and stolen billions from unsuspecting victims. And maybe, if they survived the coming confrontation, they would build something beautiful from the trust and love growing between them in the shadow of danger. La Scala Opera House glittered like a jewel in the heart of Milan, its red velvet seats filled with Europe's cultural elite gathered for the annual Renaissance Heritage Gala. Anna felt surreal walking through the legendary venue in an elegant black evening gown, knowing that beneath the civilized atmosphere, one of the largest art fraud operations in history was about to reach its climax. Lorenzo looked devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo as he guided her through the crowd, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back. To any observer, they appeared to be another wealthy couple enjoying an exclusive cultural event. Only Anna could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly scanned for potential threats among the elegantly dressed audience. The Kozlov Consortium had taken the bait perfectly. After 3 days of carefully leaked information suggesting that Anna was willing to authenticate documents for the right price, Weber had contacted them through intermediaries with an irresistible offer. They wanted her to publicly verify a newly discovered Caravaggio painting along with its supporting papal documentation, legitimizing a sale worth over 200 million euros to the Vatican Museum itself. Anna spotted Weber across the Opera House lobby, resplendent in white tie and tails as he held court near a display case containing the supposed Caravaggio masterpiece. The painting was magnificent, a religious scene depicting St. Matthew that would have been the discovery of the century if it were authentic. Even from a distance, Anna could see why experts might be fooled by the sophisticated forgery. There he is, Lorenzo murmured quietly, following her gaze toward Weber's animated conversation with several museum directors and Vatican officials. Are you ready for this? Anna squeezed his arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. 3 years ago, she'd been a grieving daughter who couldn't afford her father's funeral. Tonight, she was about to destroy the criminals who'd murdered him using the very expertise Giovanni Rossi had died protecting. I'm ready, Anna replied, meaning it completely. They approached Weber's group just as the German was explaining the painting's miraculous discovery in a forgotten monastery archive. Anna listened with growing anger as Weber described authentication techniques supposedly developed by the late, great Giovanni Rossi, perverting her father's reputation to legitimize his crimes. Dr. Rossi, Weber said warmly as she approached, his performance flawless despite the hatred she'd seen in his eyes 3 days ago. How wonderful that you've agreed to share your father's expertise with our little gathering. Anna smiled graciously while her heart hammered against her ribs. The pleasure is mine, Herr Weber. Papa always said that protecting cultural heritage was worth any personal sacrifice. The papal documentation accompanying the piece is particularly fascinating, Weber continued, gesturing toward an ornate display case containing what appeared to be 16th-century Vatican correspondence. The linguistic authentication alone represents months of careful analysis. Anna moved closer to examine the documents, aware that dozens of experts and officials were watching her every reaction. The forgeries were sophisticated, clearly created using her father's stolen research and techniques. To most observers, they would appear completely authentic. But Anna had spent countless hours in her father's workshop learning to detect the subtle differences between period authentic calligraphy and even the most skilled reproductions. The papal seal looked perfect. The parchment had been aged convincingly, but the ink composition was wrong for the supposed time period. Fascinating indeed, Anna said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent gathering. Though I'm curious about the iron gall ink composition used in this particular document. Weber's confident smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure I understand your concern, Dr. Rossi. Anna straightened, feeling her father's presence guiding her as she prepared to honor his memory in the most meaningful way possible. The ink used in this papal correspondence contains titanium dioxide, which wasn't available for manuscript production until the early 20th century. Additionally, the Latin phrase structure uses ecclesiastical constructions that weren't developed until after the Council of Trent, making it impossible for this document to have originated in the 15th century as claimed. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Anna could see shock and growing understanding on the faces of Vatican officials who'd been moments away from authorizing a massive purchase of fraudulent artifacts. Weber's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold fury beneath his cultured exterior. Dr. Rossi, he said carefully, I think you may be mistaken about certain technical details. I'm not mistaken, Anna replied firmly, her voice growing stronger as righteous anger filled her chest. And furthermore, these forgeries were created using authentication techniques stolen from my father's workshop after his murder 3 years ago. The calligraphy patterns match exactly with samples taken from his studio following his death. The accusation of murder sent shock waves through the gathering, and Anna could see security personnel beginning to move discreetly through the crowd. Weber's associates were reaching into their jackets, clearly preparing for the violent conclusion their leader had hoped to avoid. Lorenzo stepped smoothly to Anna's side, his movement somehow transforming the atmosphere in the immediate area from cultural sophistication to lethal danger. I believe what Dr. Rossi is telling us, he said quietly, is that everyone involved in this fraud operation is about to be arrested for murder and grand theft. Weber snarled something in German and lunged toward Anna, but Lorenzo intercepted him with fluid grace that spoke of serious martial arts training. Around them, the opera house erupted into controlled chaos as law enforcement officers revealed themselves among the cultural elite, efficiently surrounding Weber's associates before they could draw weapons or reach the exits. Anna found herself pressed against a marble pillar as handcuffs appeared, and Weber began shouting threats in multiple languages while being restrained by Italian police. She could see genuine fear in his eyes now that his billion-euro operation was collapsing in the most public and humiliating way possible. You have no idea what you've done, Weber screamed at her as officers dragged him away. The Kozlov family will never forgive this betrayal. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Lorenzo moved to shield Anna from Weber's vitriol, his presence both protective and comforting as the immediate threat was neutralized. She could see satisfaction in his dark eyes as he watched the criminals who destroyed her family being led away in chains. Anna realized she felt no triumph at Weber's capture, only a deep sense of completion and justice finally served. Her father's murder had been avenged and his legacy protected from further desecration. The techniques Giovanni Rossi had developed to preserve cultural heritage would never again be used to destroy the very treasures he devoted his life to protecting. As the opera house slowly returned to normal and the forged Caravaggio was carefully removed as evidence, Anna leaned against Lorenzo's strength and felt peace settle over her for the first time in 3 years. She'd honored her father's memory in the most meaningful way possible, and she'd found love with a man worthy of the trust she'd been afraid to give. The evening's performance of La Traviata would go on as scheduled, but Anna and Lorenzo had already witnessed the most dramatic conclusion of all, the moment when truth finally triumphed over sophisticated lies, and justice proved that some victories were worth any risk to achieve. 6 months later, Anna stood in the restored workshop that had once been her father's pride and joy, watching sunlight stream through windows he'd positioned specifically to illuminate manuscript analysis work. The space that criminals had ransacked and defiled was now pristine again, transformed into the Giovanni Rossi Memorial Center for Renaissance authentication research. Weber and his associates were serving 20-year sentences in maximum security prisons across Europe, while the Kozlov crime family had been systematically dismantled by international law enforcement. Over 4 billion euros in stolen artifacts had been recovered and returned to museums and collectors worldwide. More importantly, her father's name had been cleared of any association with fraud, his reputation restored as one of history's most ethical and brilliant authentication experts. Anna ran her fingers along the familiar wooden desk where Giovanni had spent countless hours perfecting techniques that preserved cultural heritage rather than exploiting it. The workshop was exactly as her father had designed it, but now it served a broader purpose as both memorial and active research center where graduate students learned to detect sophisticated forgeries. "You're thinking about him again," Lorenzo said softly from the doorway, his voice carrying the gentle understanding that had become one of her favorite things about their relationship. Anna turned to smile at the man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word. "Always," she admitted, "though it doesn't hurt anymore. Now I remember him with pride instead of grief." Lorenzo crossed the workshop to pull her into his arms, his embrace warm and familiar after months of building a life together. Anna still marveled at how naturally they'd learned to balance her academic expertise with his business acumen, creating something neither could have achieved alone. "The foundation board approved your latest proposal," Lorenzo said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We'll be expanding the Cultural Heritage Protection Program to include authentication training in 6 more universities across Europe." Anna felt a thrill of satisfaction at the news. The Vitali Foundation's Cultural Heritage Division had become her greatest professional achievement, combining Lorenzo's resources with her expertise to create educational programs that would prevent future fraud operations like the one that had destroyed her family. She'd also established herself as Europe's leading expert in Renaissance art forgery detection, consulting with major museums and auction houses to verify authenticity of questionable pieces. The irony wasn't lost on her that expertise gained through tragedy had become her greatest professional strength and her most meaningful contribution to preserving her father's legacy. "Dr. Marchetti thinks the new authentication protocols you developed could revolutionize how institutions verify historical documents," Lorenzo continued, his pride in her accomplishments evident in his voice. Anna leaned back against his chest, still amazed by how completely Lorenzo supported her career ambitions while building his own humanitarian empire. Together, they'd created something beautiful from the ashes of family tragedies, honoring both his mother's cultural preservation values and her father's commitment to protecting historical truth. "Lorenzo," Anna said quietly, suddenly nervous despite everything they'd shared over the past months. "There's something else we need to discuss about the future." She felt him tense slightly behind her, though his arms remained gentle around her waist. "What is it?" he asked, and she could hear concern beginning to color his voice. Anna turned in his embrace to face him, memorizing the strong features that had become so dear to her heart. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, watching emotions cycle rapidly across his face from shock to wonder to something that looked remarkably like pure joy. Lorenzo stared at her for a moment that felt eternal before his face transformed with the most beautiful smile Anna had ever seen. "Really?" he whispered, his hands moving instinctively to rest on her still flat stomach. "Really," Anna confirmed, covering his hands with hers as tears of happiness burned her eyes. "About 8 weeks along, according to the doctor. I wanted to be sure before telling you." Lorenzo lifted her off her feet and spun her around the workshop, both of them laughing with delight that echoed off the walls where her father had once worked in solitude. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears of happiness. "Marry me," Lorenzo said suddenly, the words tumbling out with uncharacteristic urgency. "I know we've talked about it eventually, but Anna, I want our child to be born into a family that's officially committed to each other. I want to promise you everything, forever, right here in your father's workshop where we first learned to trust each other." Anna felt her heart overflow with love for this complicated, wonderful man who'd chosen to honor her father's memory by proposing in the place that represented everything Giovanni had valued about preserving beauty and truth for future generations. "Yes," Anna whispered, then said it again more loudly as pure joy filled her chest. "Yes, Lorenzo, of course yes." They kissed, surrounded by the tools and techniques her father had used to protect cultural heritage, sealing their commitment in the space where Giovanni Rossi's legacy would continue through their work and their child. Anna could almost feel her father's approval surrounding them as they planned a future built on the foundation of justice and love they discovered together. Later, as they walked hand in hand through the gardens of Lorenzo's villa, Anna reflected on how dramatically her life had changed from that moment 6 months ago when she'd risked everything to speak truth in a restaurant. She'd lost her father but gained the strength to honor his memory. She'd exposed criminals but found her life's purpose. She'd taken enormous risks but discovered love worth any danger. Their child would grow up knowing both grandparents through stories and legacy, understanding that Giovanni Rossi had died protecting truth while the Vitali family had chosen to build something better from the ashes of past mistakes. Together, Anna and Lorenzo would raise their baby to value cultural heritage preservation and humanitarian service, creating the next generation committed to protecting beauty and fighting injustice. As sunset painted the Bay of Naples in shades of gold and pink, Anna realized that her father would have been proud not just of the justice they'd achieved, but of the love they'd built and the family they were creating. Some stories ended with vengeance, but the best ones ended with hope and new life emerging from tragedy. Standing in Lorenzo's arms with their unborn child safe between them and the future stretching bright with possibility, Anna Rossi had never been happier to have trusted her expertise enough to speak dangerous truth when it mattered most. What did you think of Anna and Lorenzo's journey from that dangerous moment of truth in the restaurant to building a family dedicated to protecting cultural heritage? Have you ever had to choose between personal safety and doing what you knew was right, even when the stakes felt overwhelming? I'd love to hear your thoughts about how love and justice can emerge from the darkest circumstances.